My name is Evelyn Grace Miller. I am 64 years old, a retired bookkeeper who spent 4 decades keeping my husband's maritime business afloat behind the scenes. 3 months ago, Daniel, my husband of 41 years, passed away. He left behind a legacy worth $48 million and more memories than I can count. The night it all began, I was standing in my son's living room. A long walnut table stretched between us, polished to a shine, set under cold LED light that made every corner of the room feel sterile. The plates on the sideboard gleamed like they had never held a single meal. Across from me sat Michael, my only child, the boy I had once rocked through feverish nights, the man I'd watched walk away in a tailored suit on his first day at the firm. Now, his tone was something I had never heard before. "If you don't sign this, Mom," he said, tapping the stack of legal papers between us, "you are no longer part of this family." I looked at the heading, Power of Attorney, my name in black ink, waiting for my signature. His name listed beneath mine as the sole controlling party. My hand went cold. A memory flashed. The meeting at Arthur Blake's law office just 2 weeks before. Daniel's attorney had sat me down, glasses low on his nose, and read the will Daniel had signed. I had been named the sole heir to every cent, every share, every property. My son and his wife Clara were not mentioned except to note that they had been provided for during their adult lives. I remembered the way Michael's face had tightened as Arthur spoke. I remembered Clara's lips parting, then pressing together again, as though holding back a curse. And I remembered Arthur sliding a separate envelope toward me. Daniel made his intentions clear, Evelyn. He wanted you to be the steward of everything you built together. That night, after the will reading, Michael didn't call. Clara didn't text. But here we were now, their dining room heavy with the scent of lemon polish and something sharper. The unspoken truth that this wasn't about grief. It was about control. Michael leaned forward, his voice lower, sharper. "Dad built Miller Maritime so the family could live well. You have no idea how to handle $48 million. You'll waste it. Sign this, and I'll manage it for all of us. You'll be taken care of." I studied his face. My son's eyes had Daniel's color, but none of his patience. Clara sat at his side, back straight, manicured nails resting on the table edge. She smiled like we were discussing vacation plans. "Think about it, Evelyn," she said. "You don't have to deal with the stress. Keep a few million for yourself. Live out your days in comfort. Leave the real work to Michael." My voice stayed calm. "This isn't what your father wanted." Michael's jaw clenched. "This is what's fair." For a moment, I let the silence settle between us. I thought about the nights I stayed up to balance Daniel's accounts when he was at sea, the meals I packed for Michael through school, the clothes I mended, the linens I washed, the life I built around them both. In my head, I heard the words forming. My truth, simple and solid. I used to be the one who washed every towel for that boy. Now he wants to wash my life clean out of his memory. Michael slid the pen toward me. "Sign it." I reached for the pen. My fingers curled around it, felt its weight. Then I set it down on the paper, not to sign, but to push it back across the table. No. It was just one word, but it filled the room. Clara's smile faltered. Michael's nostrils flared. "You're making a mistake," he said. I stood, smoothing the front of my sweater. "I've made mistakes before, Michael. This isn't one of them." That night, They locked me out of the apartment I had lived in since Daniel's health started to decline. An apartment Michael conveniently owned through one of his real estate companies. I packed 2 suitcases from the back porch under the watchful eyes of a hired security guard and drove into the darkness toward Daniel's estate by the sea. By the time the sun rose, I had unlocked the front door with the key Daniel had pressed into my hand years ago, saying, "This place will always be yours, Evie." What I didn't know then was that the next morning, Michael would come for it, storming down the driveway to take what he believed was his, and that he would stop cold when he saw who stood beside me. Before I tell you what happened, if you believe in standing your ground when family tests your worth, click like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. It helps share stories like this with others who need to hear them, because sometimes the quietest no is the loudest thing you can say. I was 22 the summer I met Daniel Miller. Back then, the harbor was my second home. I worked as a clerk in a cramped port office, logging manifests, filing bills of lading, and answering phones that never stopped ringing. Daniel was a deckhand on a rust-stained tugboat, all sun-browned skin, and a grin that could split the grayest morning. I remember the first time I saw him, leaning against the rail with his sleeves rolled up, a thermos in one hand, grease smudged along his jaw like it belonged there. He had this way of looking at you, steady and unhurried, like he was measuring the truth in your face. We talked over coffee from the vending machine in the dockside break room. By the third conversation, he was telling me about his dream to own a fleet, to build a company from the ground up so no one could tell him when or where to work. I'd heard plenty of men talk big, but there was something different in his voice. Less boast, more blueprint. When we started seeing each other, dates weren't candlelit dinners or movie nights. They were lunches on the tugboat deck, the air thick with salt and diesel. I would sit, cross-legged on a coil of rope, while he ate a sandwich out of a brown paper bag. And sometimes he'd pull an apple from his pocket. Even with his fingers slick from engine oil, he would slice it carefully with his pocket knife and offer me the larger half. "Fuel for the bookkeeper," he'd say, as if keeping ledgers and schedules was as vital as steering the boat. By the time we married, Daniel had saved enough to buy his first vessel outright, a beat-up but sturdy tug named the Maribel. We christened it together, him with the bottle of champagne, me with a clipboard full of invoices and a hand-painted ledger board. He handled the sea, I handled the shore. That was our pact. Then came Michael. I was 26, Daniel was 30. Motherhood wasn't something I had planned with any precision, but when Michael was born, every other priority blurred. Daniel was out on the water more often than not, and I became the constant. Diapers, midnight feedings, pediatric checkups, then school drop-offs and homework at the kitchen table. For a while, I tried to keep my own small bookkeeping clients on the side. But one winter, when Daniel took on a high-risk tow that kept him gone for weeks, Michael got sick with pneumonia. I remember sitting in the hospital room under that flickering fluorescent light, realizing I couldn't keep straddling two worlds. I let the last of my clients go, turned my focus entirely to home and to Miller Maritime. Supporting the business from behind the scenes meant more than paperwork. I fielded calls from suppliers when Daniel was out of radio range. I kept payroll on track, even if it meant hand-delivering checks to crewmen's wives. I learned the rhythms of the harbor so well I could tell by the smell of the wind whether the fleet would be in early or late. On my 30th birthday, Daniel handed me a small velvet box over breakfast. Inside was a silver hair clip, simple but finely made, engraved with the date we'd launched the Maribel. "Something to keep your hair out of your eyes when you're working," he said, but I knew it was more than that. It was a marker, a reminder of the life we were building side by side. I wore it almost every day, even when I was just folding laundry or making stew. It became part of me, the way my wedding band was. Years blurred into decades. We grew the company from one tug to a fleet of 6, added a maintenance yard, and opened an office that didn't smell perpetually of oil and seaweed. Michael grew up with the sound of engines and gulls as his lullaby. He spent summers painting hulls and coiling rope, though Daniel never pushed him toward the business. We thought we were giving him the choice we never had, freedom to decide his own path. Looking back, maybe that was the first crack. Michael saw the comforts that came from hard work, but not always the work itself. And I, in my quiet pride, never thought to show him the ledger books late at night, the stacks of unpaid invoices I chased down, the silent worry when fuel prices spiked. Still, for most of our marriage, we were a team. Even in disagreements, Daniel had a way of ending them with a nod, a half smile, and, "We'll figure it out, Evie." And we always did. That hair clip stayed with me through all of it. Company meetings, christening new vessels, family holidays when Daniel came home smelling of sea spray. It was the thing I reached for without thinking. The small piece of silver that said, no matter what else shifted, some things were anchored. I didn't know then how much I'd need that anchor. Not until Daniel was gone, and the tides in my own family turned in ways I never could have imagined. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning in late May, in the middle of watering his rose bushes. I had been inside rinsing breakfast dishes when the sound of the hose hitting the ground made me glance out the window. He was lying there on the brick path, his hand still half curled as if holding the spray nozzle. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. They said it was quick, that a massive heart attack had taken him before he could even feel the pain. The house felt hollow after that. The kitchen smelled of roses for days, the hose still coiled in a damp heap where I'd left it. Friends came and went, bringing casseroles I barely touched. I moved through it all on autopilot, my mind replaying our last conversation. Him reminding me to check the mail for a part he'd ordered. Me telling him not to overwater the yellow blooms. At the funeral, I wore the silver hair clip he'd given me decades ago. Its weight on my head, like an anchor. Michael arrived late, already on his phone as he walked toward the graveside, one finger pressed to his ear. Clara trailed a few steps behind, heels sinking into the grass. She pulled out her phone before the service even began, angling it toward the arrangements around the casket. "For the thank you post later," she whispered, as if it were a normal part of grief. I stood still, hands clasped, watching the pastor's lips move while my son kept checking his screen. When the final prayer ended, Daniel's oldest crewman lined up to shake my hand, their palms rough and warm. Michael drifted away halfway through, tapping at his phone again. 2 weeks later, Arthur Blake called. Daniel's attorney for over 30 years, Arthur had been both business counsel and friend. "Evelyn," he said, "we need to go over Daniel's will. Can you come in tomorrow? Michael will be there as well." His office sat in a converted brick building by the waterfront. The smell of salt air still reached the lobby, mingling with the scent of old leather chairs. Michael was already in the conference room when I arrived, wearing a navy suit and a look that could cut steel. Clara sat beside him in a cream blouse, scrolling her phone without looking up. Arthur greeted me with a small nod and gestured for me to sit. He opened a thick folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read in that steady, deliberate way of his. I, Daniel Miller, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave all assets, personal, financial, and business, to my wife, Evelyn Grace Miller. This includes, but is not limited to, all bank accounts, investments, real estate, and full ownership of Miller Maritime, valued at approximately $48 million. I make no provision for my son, Michael Miller, or his wife, Clara Miller, as they have been provided for during their adult lives. The words landed like stones in a still pond. I felt the room go quiet, the air heavy. Michael's face drained, then flushed dark. Clara's phone slipped from her hand onto the table with a soft thud. Arthur continued. Daniel executed this will on February 10th of last year. At that time, he underwent a full medical evaluation to confirm competency. I have here the certificate from Dr. Lowell, stating he was of full sound mind and understood all provisions. He slid the document across the table toward me. Michael snatched it up before I could touch it. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Dad would never cut me out, not unless someone convinced him to. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and accusing. What did you say to him, Mom? I kept my voice even. Nothing he didn't already know. Clara leaned forward, her tone sugar-coated but her eyes hard. You can't possibly run a company, Evelyn. Michael's been preparing for this his whole life. Let him take the burden. Arthur cleared his throat. Daniel's decision was clear and deliberate. He wanted Evelyn to have full control. Michael pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping the hardwood. We'll see about that. This isn't over. I didn't answer. I just reached for the silver hair clip at the back of my head, pressing it lightly between my fingers, and waited for the storm I knew was coming. That evening, Michael called and asked me to come to his house. His voice was clipped, businesslike, the way Daniel's used to be when negotiating with a supplier. I drove over under a low, bruised sky, the air thick with the promise of rain. Their dining room looked like a photo from a home magazine. Dimmed pendant lights, polished wood table, a centerpiece of white lilies that smelled too sweet. Clara greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and poured me a glass of wine before I could refuse. We've been talking, she began, sliding into her chair beside Michael. This situation could still work out for everyone. You've inherited so much, Evelyn, more than anyone needs for one lifetime. The fair thing is to share. She said the word share like it was a gift I'd been denying her. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Clara's right. $48 million is a lot to manage. It's complicated. You're not used to that kind of responsibility. Let me handle it. We'll keep things in the family. I sipped the wine, letting the silence stretch. Daniel wanted me to make those decisions. Michael's mouth tightened. Dad wanted the family taken care of. That's what I'm doing. But if you insist on holding on to everything, you might find your life gets less comfortable. I met his eyes. Is that a threat? He leaned back, his tone almost casual. You know that condo you live in? The one near the marina? I own the building through one of my LLCs. If we can't come to an agreement, I could have your lease terminated. You'd have to move out. Quickly. The words hit like cold seawater. For a second, I felt as if the floor had tilted, like I was back on a deck in rough weather with nothing to grab. My own son, the boy I'd taught to swim, was threatening to push me out into open water with no life ring. Clara reached for my hand across the table, her rings flashing in the light. This doesn't have to get ugly. Sign over control, keep a few million for yourself, and live without the stress. Isn't that better than fighting? I looked down at her fingers, perfectly manicured, resting lightly on mine as if she were offering comfort instead of closing a trap. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up with Michael's fevers, the lunches I'd packed, the times I'd mended his shirts before a big interview. All of it seemed to shrink to a pinprick in that moment, swallowed by the cold calculation in his voice. I set my glass down and stood. Thank you for dinner. I'll see myself out. Michael's voice followed me. Think about it, Mom. This is your last chance to make the right decision. Outside, the rain had finally broken, steady and unrelenting. I walked to my car, but instead of starting the engine, I sat there for a long minute, listening to the drumming on the roof. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sharp, clear knowledge that the line had been crossed. Back at the condo, the security light flicked on as I opened the door. I went straight to the bedroom closet and pulled out 2 suitcases. Into them went the essentials: clothes, toiletries, the folder of important documents I kept in the filing cabinet. From the top shelf, I reached for the small cedar box Daniel had carved years ago. Inside were the letters he'd written me over the decades, tied in a bundle with twine. I slipped the box into my bag. When I zipped the last suitcase, I looked around the room one more time. The furniture, the framed photos, the curtains I'd sewn myself. It all felt like it belonged to another life. I wheeled the suitcases to the door, grabbed my raincoat, and stepped outside. The hallway smelled faintly of wet concrete. I locked the door behind me, not because I expected to come back, but because leaving it open felt too much like surrender. By the time I reached the parking lot, the rain was soaking through my coat. I loaded the suitcases into the trunk and placed the cedar box gently on the passenger seat. As I slid into the driver's side, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the window, hair damp, face set, eyes steady. I started the engine and pulled out, the wipers swiping back and forth in a steady rhythm. Somewhere out there, beyond the curtain of rain, was Daniel's house by the sea. The place he'd once told me would always be mine. Tonight, it would be my harbor. The drive to the coast took just over an hour, the highway mostly empty at that late hour. The rain kept me company the whole way, softening to a mist as I neared the water. When I turned down the narrow road that led to Daniel's house, the smell of salt and pine hit me like a wave. The headlights swept over the familiar front porch, the cedar shingles dark with damp. I unlocked the door, the key fitting as easily as it had the day he gave it to me. The hinges creaked in the same spot, a sound that felt like a welcome. Inside, the air held the faint scent of pine wood and the trace of Daniel's cologne, the one with a hint of sandalwood he wore every day. His raincoat still hung by the door, the cuffs stiff from the last storm he'd been caught in. I set the suitcases just inside, but I didn't unpack. The ocean's low rumble came through the walls, steady and deep, grounding me. I walked through the room slowly, my fingers brushing over surfaces as if greeting old friends. The living room rug still held a small ripple where he'd once spilled coffee and laughed at his own clumsiness. On the mantel, the clock ticked faintly, keeping time as if nothing had changed. In the kitchen, I switched on the light over the stove. The warm yellow glow softened everything. The worn wood of the cabinets, the pale ceramic canisters labeled in my handwriting, the chipped edge of the counter where Daniel used to lean while telling me about his day. I ran my hand along the cool surface, remembering the countless dinners we'd cooked side by side here. I opened the top drawer by the fridge, where Daniel kept little odds and ends, rubber bands, spare keys, a penknife. Beneath a folded linen napkin was a small envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. My breath caught. The paper was thick, and the ink had bled slightly at the curves of the letters. I sat at the kitchen table before opening it, the legs of the chair scraping softly against the floor. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. His words were simple. Keep it, and use it as you see fit. No explanations needed. I trust you. The handwriting sloped a little, as if he'd written it quickly, but there was nothing rushed about the weight of those words. My throat tightened. Daniel had never been a man of long speeches, but when he said something, it rooted itself in you. I set the letter down and reached into my coat pocket for the silver hair clip. The metal was cool against my palm, the surface still smooth except for a tiny scratch on the clasp. He'd given it to me when I turned 30, saying it reminded him of moonlight on water. I hadn't worn it in years, but now, holding it in this house, it felt like the anchor I hadn't realized I'd been drifting toward. I leaned back in the chair, the hum of the refrigerator and the ocean's heartbeat blending into a steady rhythm. Outside the kitchen window, the waves rolled in, their crests catching what little light filtered through the clouds. I could almost hear Daniel's voice, low and calm, telling me that storms pass, and the tide always returns. I stayed there for a long time, the letter open beside me, my hand resting over the clip. This house was more than walls and a roof. It was the last place that felt entirely ours, untouched by anyone else's claims. Tonight, it became my sanctuary. Tomorrow, it would be the place I began again. The morning light in this part of the coast always came slow, filtered through mist before it reached the windows. I was still in my robe when I heard tires on gravel and the low murmur of voices. When I opened the front door, Arthur stood there with his leather briefcase, and beside him was a woman in a tailored navy coat, her dark hair pinned neatly back. Behind them, a broad-shouldered man in a windbreaker carried what looked like an old canvas logbook. "Evelyn," Arthur greeted me with that measured tone he always used when business mattered. "I hope you don't mind. There are a couple of people Daniel wanted you to meet. Well, re-meet, in one case." The woman stepped forward. "Marina Lopez," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was warm, steady. "I handled your husband's financial affairs for the past 15 years. The man nodded. "Tom Harris, portmaster down at Miller Maritime, worked with Daniel since he first tied a rope at the dock." His voice carried the easy cadence of someone who'd spent his life near water. I ushered them in, the smell of coffee still hanging in the air. We sat around the kitchen table, the same one where Daniel and I had made so many decisions, large and small. Marina slid a leather-bound folder toward me. These are the complete asset portfolios: real estate, investments, company holdings. Daniel kept everything in your name or in the trust, separate from any external claims. He was meticulous. I traced the edge of the folder with my finger before opening it. Inside were tabs labeled with neat precision. Properties I'd half forgotten we owned. Accounts with steady, quiet growth. There was no excess, no hidden mess, just the kind of careful structure Daniel always believed in. Tom placed the logbook on the table next, its cover scuffed from years of salt air. "He told me to bring this to you when the time came," Tom said. "It's not business records. It's his own notes." The pages smelled faintly of oil and sea. Daniel's handwriting filled them. Title schedules, repair logs, sketches of dock layouts. Then, further in, words that made my chest tighten. June 12th, 2019. Michael asked again about selling the harbor to that development group. Told him no. The water is our lifeline, not a bargaining chip. Evelyn understands that. She sees the harbor for what it is: work, legacy, community. That's why it should be hers when I'm gone. I blinked, the words swimming for a moment. Daniel hadn't said much about that meeting back then, just mentioned that Michael had ideas. But here it was, in his own hand, the reasoning laid bare. Another entry, August 4th, 2021. If Arthur reads this, it means I'm not here. Make sure Evelyn knows she has the final say. She's weathered storms I can't even name. That's why she'll protect what matters. I closed the book carefully, my hand resting on the worn cover. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt something other than hollow grief. It was the shape of a truth. Daniel had chosen me not out of habit or obligation, but out of trust. Arthur leaned back slightly, watching me. He didn't keep many people close, Evelyn, but the ones he did, well, you're looking at them. Marina smiled faintly. We're here for you, not because it's our job, but because Daniel made it clear you're the one to carry this forward. It struck me then. This was my team now, not family by blood, but by choice. People who knew Daniel's principles, who respected what we'd built. People who weren't here to take, but to stand beside me. I poured more coffee, my hands steadier than they'd been in days. Outside, the tide was coming in, the water pushing gently against the pilings. Inside, I felt a quiet shift, like the keel of a boat finding balance after a sudden wave. Whatever came next, I wasn't alone. The text came just after dinner, when the kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. My phone lit up with Michael's name, the words clipped and cold. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., I'm coming to get Dad's things. Don't make this difficult. I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the screen. There was no greeting, no question, not even a please. Just an expectation, like he was sending a courier to collect a package. Arthur was still sitting at the table, reviewing some documents with Marina. I slid the phone toward him. His eyes narrowed as he read. "Let him come," he said after a beat, his voice low and certain. "We'll be ready." I looked at him. "Arthur, I'm not looking for a war." He shook his head. "This isn't a war, Evelyn. It's a line in the sand. They don't get to decide what's theirs just by saying so. You've got the will, the trust, the title, and the law on your side. But you also have something more powerful. They know you're not afraid to stand alone." I wanted to believe that, but my stomach was tight, the same way it had been the first time I sent Michael to kindergarten and watched him cry at the door. Back then, I wanted to scoop him up and make the world gentle for him. Now, he was the one bringing the storm to my doorstep. After Arthur and Marina left, I walked through the house slowly. Daniel's raincoat still hung by the door, his boots lined up neatly beneath. On the mantel, the silver hair clip he'd given me at 30 rested in a small glass dish, catching the light from the lamp. That little piece of metal had been through every move, every season. I slipped it into my pocket without thinking. Upstairs, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were the letters Daniel had written me over the years, the ink fading, but the words still strong. I set them carefully in the wooden box I'd brought from Michael's place, along with the framed photo from our 25th anniversary. If Michael wanted to come for Dad's things, he wouldn't find them lying around. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, making a quiet list. Arthur had arranged for a notary to be here in the morning, along with Tom from the harbor. Marina would be back too, with copies of every relevant document. It wasn't about locking the place down. It was about making it clear that this wasn't an abandoned house he could just walk into. This was my home now. At some point after midnight, the rain started, soft at first, then steady against the windows. I thought of that night at Michael's, stepping out into the downpour with my suitcases. How the cold had hit me, how the sound of the door shutting behind me had echoed in my chest. I'd felt then like I was being pushed out into open water without a life preserver. But this time was different. This time, I was the one on the shore, watching the tide come in, choosing where to stand. By 4 a.m., I was dressed and ready. The house smelled faintly of the coffee I'd set to brew. I tied my hair back, fastening it with the silver clip. My reflection in the window was calmer than I expected, lined from years, yes, but steady-eyed. The clock ticked toward morning. I knew the knock would come. I also knew that when it did, I'd open the door not as someone waiting to see what they'd take, but as the keeper of what Daniel had entrusted to me. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I was done being told to stand aside. Just after sunrise, there was a knock at the back door. Gentle, familiar. I opened it to find Eleanor Briggs, wrapped in a wool shawl, her silver hair tucked neatly under a rain hat. She'd been a Superior Court judge for 30 years before retiring to this stretch of coast, and she had the kind of presence that made even silence feel like a verdict. She stepped inside without asking, setting a basket of scones on the counter. "I heard what's going on," she said, her eyes steady on mine. "If it comes to it, I'll be your witness." Her hug was warm but firm, the kind that told you someone had already decided they were on your side. I didn't realize, until then, how much I'd needed that. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than she knew. Marina arrived next, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She went straight to the dining table, setting up her computer and a small portable printer. "I've downloaded every relevant file," she said, fingers already moving. "Bank statements, trust documents, the updated title for the property, everything time-stamped and notarized." Tom came in just behind her, carrying a heavy binder. "I made hard copies of Daniel's harbor logs and his personal journal entries," he said. "These are the pages that mention Michael and his offers to sell. And here," he tapped a flagged section, "this is where Daniel writes that the harbor will stay in the family, but in your name only. Arthur was last to arrive, his coat still damp from the fog. He set his briefcase down and pulled out a folder. "Security's on standby," he said. "2 men from the firm will be stationed at the gate. I've also scheduled the installation of cameras this afternoon. Even if they try to twist this into some emotional scene, we'll have a clear record of everything." I felt a quiet hum of readiness in the house, as if each person brought with them another layer of defense, another reason to stand tall. When they'd settled into their tasks, I stepped away for a moment. The living room window framed the sea in soft gray light. Outside, the tide was rolling in, slow and certain, the white edges of waves folding against the shore. I rested my hand on the sill, and the memory came back in full color. Daniel, on the day we signed the deed to this place, pressing the house keys into my palm. "This is yours as much as it's mine," he'd said. "If I'm ever gone, I want you here. Safe." That was years ago, before Michael had hardened into someone I barely recognized. Back then, the keys felt like a gesture of love. Now, they felt like a promise I was obligated to keep. I stood there a while, letting the sound of the waves work through me. Today wouldn't be easy, but the people in this house and the paper trail we'd built were more than defense. They were proof that I wasn't alone. Not really. Behind me, I could hear the quiet murmur of voices, the tap of keys, the shuffle of papers. Every sound was a piece of the wall we were building, brick by brick, between my life and the storm about to knock on the door. When I finally turned from the window, I felt steadier. Not because I believed Michael would back down, but because I knew I was ready for whatever came next. And readiness, I'd learned, was its own kind of peace. At exactly 9 o'clock, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the quiet. I stood in the living room, hands loosely clasped, watching through the front window as Michael's SUV came into view. Clara was in the passenger seat, sunglasses on despite the cloudy morning. They didn't look at the house until the engine cut off. The moment they stepped inside, their expressions shifted. They had expected me alone, maybe unsure, maybe pleading. Instead, they found Arthur seated at the dining table with a neat stack of documents, Marina with her laptop open and printer humming softly, Tom with the harbor log resting on his knee, and Eleanor in the armchair by the window, shawl folded over her lap like she had all the time in the world. Michael's voice was clipped. "We're here for Dad's personal effects." Arthur didn't rise, but his gaze was steady. "We'll be happy to review anything that legally belongs to you, Michael. But first, there are a few matters to clarify." Clara crossed her arms, her eyes darting to me. "We don't have time for games." Marina turned the laptop toward them, the glow of the screen reflecting in her glasses. "This isn't a game. These are the records of every financial transaction in the last 4 years, where company funds were transferred to accounts controlled by you, Michael. Not loans to the business, personal expenses. They total over $240,000. None repaid." She tapped the space bar, bringing up another document. "Here are your signed acknowledgments for each withdrawal." Michael's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. Clara shifted beside him, the first flicker of unease crossing her face. Tom stood then, flipping open the harbor log. His voice was even, carrying the calm authority of someone used to speaking over the wind. Daniel made notes after every meeting about the harbor's future. Here's one from June 12th, 2019. He read aloud Daniel's exact words about refusing Michael's request to sell to developers, about keeping the harbor in the family under my care alone. Michael's hand curled into a fist. That's his handwriting, not his voice. You've all twisted. I stepped forward then, not raising my voice. You're worried about losing face, Michael. I'm worried about losing myself. The room went very still. It was a line I hadn't planned, but it landed with the weight of truth. His eyes flickered, just for a second, like he'd heard me before he decided not to. I'm your mother, I continued, my tone steady, and I have spent decades protecting this family. I've done it quietly, without asking for recognition, without demanding anything in return. But this, I gestured to the papers, the logbook, the people in the room. This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about facts, legal, documented facts. Arthur slid a manila envelope toward Michael. Copies for your records. Should you wish to contest, we'll be prepared to respond in court. But I advise against it. Clara opened her mouth, but Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice calm and unyielding. I've presided over enough hearings to know when a case is airtight. If you push this, you'll lose more than you came for. Michael's gaze swept the room again, lingering on each face. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the quick math of pride versus probability. He took the envelope but didn't open it. I thought you'd at least try to work with us, he said finally. I am working with you, I said, still without heat. I'm giving you the chance to walk out that door with dignity. What you do with that is up to you. No shouting, no name-calling, just the truth laid out on the table, as undeniable as the tide hitting the shore outside. He turned then, Clara following, the door closing harder than it needed to. When the sound of the SUV faded down the drive, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. I hadn't won a battle. I'd simply refused to surrender myself. And that, I realized, was the only victory I'd been after all along. I waited until Michael had his hand on the doorknob before I spoke again. My voice was low, but it carried. There's something you don't know, I said. He stopped, shoulders stiffening, but didn't turn around. Clara glanced between us, suspicion written across her face. I stepped closer, steadying myself with the back of a chair. Daniel didn't always plan to leave the company to me. For years, his intention was to hand it over to you, Michael. He believed it would be your legacy. He talked about it often, how proud he'd be to see you continue what he started. That made him turn. His expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of something, hope, confusion, maybe both. Then why didn't he? I took a slow breath. Because one afternoon, he walked into the harbor office and overheard you. You were talking to a developer about selling the property, not just the docks, everything. The slips, the warehouse, the fueling station. The sale would have gutted the community here. Dozens of families would have lost their livelihoods. His face changed, the calculation faltering for the first time. That was just a conversation, he said quickly. Nothing was decided. It was enough for him, I replied. Daniel believed in keeping the harbor alive because it kept this town alive. When he realized you didn't see it that way, he changed the will, quietly, without telling you, without telling anyone except me. Silence filled the room, heavy and unbroken. Even Clara stayed still, her arms no longer crossed. Michael's gaze dropped for a moment, then lifted again, sharper now, as if he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. I didn't push. I didn't raise my voice or fill the air with accusations. I let the truth sit between us, solid and immovable, the way Daniel had left it. "You think this is about money," I said finally. "It's not. It's about responsibility. Daniel entrusted me with something bigger than both of us, because he knew I wouldn't sell it for a quick gain. He knew I would protect the people who depend on it." Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might say he understood. But the moment passed. Without another word, he opened the door. The cold morning air swept in, carrying the scent of the sea. He stepped out, Clara following closely, their footsteps fading down the gravel path. I stood there until I could no longer hear them, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. I hadn't convinced him, but I hadn't needed to. The truth was no longer buried, and I had spoken it aloud, not to win him over, but to remind myself why I was standing my ground. When I closed the door, the house felt quieter, but not empty. It felt like a place where Daniel's voice could still be heard, even in the stillness. And that was enough for me. The silence came first. No calls, no texts, no terse one-line emails. Michael had gone completely dark, as if cutting the cord could erase the last 48 years of our shared life. I had given birth to him, held his hand through measles and college rejection letters. But now there was nothing but a blank space where my son had been. The silence might have been easier to bear if not for the whispers. One morning, over coffee at the small cafe near the marina, I noticed two women from the Chamber of Commerce leaning in at the next table. They didn't see me at first, but their words carried just enough. "She's clinging to the business for power," one said. "I heard she pushed her own son out." Later that afternoon, Tom stopped by and closed the door behind him. "Clara's been making the rounds," he said carefully. "She's not naming you directly, but she's telling people the harbor's in trouble. That you're unstable." The word landed like a stone in my chest. I'd spent decades building a reputation for steady hands and calm decisions. Now, with a few carefully dropped insinuations, Clara was trying to undo it. I stood at the kitchen counter, my fingers curling around the edge until my knuckles whitened. I could have confronted her publicly. I could have called her a liar in the same meeting she frequented. But what would that serve? It would drag me into the very arena she wanted, public spectacle, and I refused to step into her ring. That night, I sat at the small vanity in the bedroom Daniel and I once shared. The silver hairpin he'd given me for my 30th birthday rested in its velvet-lined box. I lifted it out, feeling the familiar weight in my hand. It had always been more than an accessory. It was a small piece of armor, a reminder of who I was before anyone else's opinion tried to define me. As I slid it into my hair, catching the light from the bedside lamp, I realized I was performing a ritual. Every time I left the house now, whether to walk the docks, attend a council meeting, or shop for groceries, I wore it. Not to make a statement to others, but to anchor myself. In the quiet of that room, I spoke aloud, just once. "Forgiving doesn't mean I let you do it again." The words were for Michael, for Clara, and maybe for myself. I could forgive the hurt enough to live without bitterness, but forgiveness was not a revolving door. It was a boundary line. Once crossed, it meant something had to change. I began to adjust my routines. Meetings were held in my space, on my terms. Marina sat in on every significant discussion, not because I doubted my own memory or resolve, but because it sent a message. I am not alone. Tom increased his oversight at the harbor, keeping operations running so smoothly that any rumors about instability rang hollow. The calls from the chamber kept coming. Polite invitations to clear the air, to set the record straight. I declined each one. If they wanted to know the truth, they could come to the source. I wouldn't go chasing their approval. Weeks passed, and the gossip began to lose its shine. People get bored when you don't play the part they expect. I continued my work, paid my staff, showed up to every obligation prepared and unshaken. The harbor thrived despite the noise, and slowly the noise faded. Michael still didn't call. Some nights, that absence felt like an amputation. But in the mornings, when I pinned my hair and faced the day, I remembered what Daniel once told me. You can't control the weather, Evie, only how you steer through it. The weather was rough now, unpredictable, but my hands were steady on the wheel. And as long as I remembered where my course lay, I didn't need the approval of anyone standing on the shore. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, tucked among the usual stack of bills and harbor reports. The envelope was hand-addressed in neat, slanted script, the paper slightly worn at the edges as though it had been handled often before it reached me. Inside was a single page, folded with care. Mrs. Miller, we wanted you to know that when my husband's fishing boat sank last winter, the emergency fund your husband established kept us afloat, literally and otherwise. We were able to pay the mortgage, keep our children in school, and rebuild enough to buy another boat. Daniel saved more than our livelihood. He saved our dignity. Thank you for carrying on his work. It was signed by Grace and Peter Caldwell, names I knew only in passing from the harbor community. As I read it again, my eyes stung in the way that makes you stop blinking, as if holding the moment still might keep it from spilling over. I set the letter on the table and sat for a long while, letting the words sink in. The harbor wasn't just docks and rope and the smell of diesel. It was the heartbeat of families whose faces I might never see, but whose lives were tied to these waters as much as mine was. That afternoon, I pulled out the wooden box Daniel had given me decades ago, the one that held his letters, small mementos, and my own private words. From the drawer of the writing desk, I took a sheet of cream stationery and began to write. Michael, there are things I wish I could tell you without them feeling like accusations. You were meant to have this business, and once upon a time, we both believed you would keep it safe. But I've learned that safety isn't just about profit. It's about people. And I can't hand over something built on trust to someone who doesn't see the hands holding it up. I paused, staring at the ink drying on the page. This wasn't a letter I would send. Not now. Maybe not ever. But it was the truth, and the act of writing it was for me, not for him. I folded it carefully and placed it in the box among the others, where it would rest alongside years of unspoken thoughts. The next morning, the threshold motif came for the third time. The front door stood open to a group of high school students and their advisor, carrying folders and wearing the nervous excitement of those about to step into a new chapter of life. They were recipients of the Miller Maritime Scholarship, a program Daniel and I had started, but that had grown since his passing. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let them pass. The salt air followed them inside, mingling with the smell of fresh-baked bread cooling in the kitchen. I led them into the living room, where Marina had laid out refreshments, and Tom had set up a slideshow of their future colleges and apprenticeships. As they settled in, I felt something shift. The house, which had so recently been a fortress against hurt, was now opening itself to possibility. This was not about reclaiming the past or proving a point to those who had doubted me. This was about choosing where my energy would go next. I glanced toward the wooden box on the shelf in the corner. It held my grief, my boundaries, my unsent words. But it also held the reminder that some things are worth protecting quietly, steadily, without the need for applause. The students laughed at something Tom said, their voices bright against the steady hum of the sea outside. And for the first time in months, I realized I was no longer holding my breath. A new chapter had begun, not because I had closed the door on my son, but because I had opened it to something greater than the hurt he'd left behind. 6 months later, the rhythm of my life had changed. The harbor still hummed with the sounds of engines, gulls, and the slap of ropes against wooden posts. But my days now began in an office at the Daniel Miller Scholarship Foundation. The name was stenciled in navy blue above the door, visible from the main street, and every time I unlocked it in the morning, I felt Daniel's hand at my back, steadying me. We had expanded the program since those first nervous students visited my living room. Now, the foundation provided tuition support, trade school stipends, and emergency grants to the children of harbor workers. Marina, who had once managed my finances with quiet precision, had agreed to serve as my senior advisor. She was in the office 3 days a week, going over applications, finding new donors, and reminding me when I worked too late. Tom kept the harbor running like clockwork, but he also became the bridge between our work and the people it served. He'd drop by with updates, news of a young welder who'd just graduated, a deckhand's daughter who had been accepted to a university upstate. Every story felt like a small thread in the fabric Daniel and I had started weaving decades ago. Eleanor had taken it upon herself to organize an annual tribute to Daniel. She said the harbor needed a day to remember its history and its heart. This year, the event would be bigger than ever. Boats decorated with bunting, a communal meal on the pier, and a moment of silence for those lost at sea. She had even convinced the town council to dedicate a bench at the water's edge in Daniel's name. The morning of the tribute, I stood before my bedroom mirror. The light through the curtains was soft, tinting everything in a warm gold. On the vanity lay the silver hairpin. I picked it up, turning it between my fingers, the metal cool against my skin. I remember Daniel placing it in my hair on my 30th birthday, his smile warm and proud. Back then, it had been a gift of love. Now, it was also a symbol of resilience, a kind of quiet armor I carried into the world. As I slid it into place, I studied my reflection. Time had left its marks on my face, but it had also given me something else. A steadiness that came from surviving storms without losing sight of the shore. I arrived early at the pier, helping Eleanor arrange the tables. Marina handled the guest list, greeting donors and old friends, while Tom coordinated the docking of boats. The air was alive with the smell of grilled fish and the faint sweetness of baked goods from the community bake sale. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped to the microphone and looked out at the faces gathered. Families, fishermen, council members, and scholarship students, some of them already wearing the uniforms of their chosen paths. I told them about Daniel's belief in hard work, in fairness, in protecting the harbor not just for profit, but for the people who made it pulse with life. I didn't mention the battles of the past year. This day wasn't about the fights or the fractures. It was about what had endured. After the speeches, we walked to the new bench. The plaque read, "In memory of Daniel Miller, captain, husband, friend. He kept the harbor safe." I sat there for a moment, the silver hairpin catching the sun, listening to the waves and the distant call of a gull. The sound was both present and eternal, like Daniel himself. And in that moment, I knew the legacy wasn't just in the foundation, the harbor, or the bench. It was in the way we continued, quietly, steadily, together. It was late afternoon when the email came in. The subject line was simple: opportunity for collaboration. The sender was Michael. For a moment, I didn't open it. My hands rested on the desk, fingers lightly touching the wood grain, the cursor blinking beside the unopened message like a quiet metronome. 6 months of silence had passed since he walked out of my house without looking back. In that time, I'd learned to live without waiting for his voice on the phone or his name in my inbox. Still, curiosity tugged at me. I clicked. The message was longer than I expected, written in a clipped but polite tone. He'd started a new investment venture, he said, a series of waterfront developments in nearby towns. There was a proposal attached, a sleek PDF with projections and renderings. He suggested we collaborate, given my unique access to harbor resources and the mutual benefit it might bring. At the end, a single line stood out. I believe this could be a chance for us to work together again. I read it twice, not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to be certain of the tone. It was businesslike, but beneath it, there was something else. Perhaps the faintest trace of assumption that I might be flattered, or relieved, or eager to repair the bridge he had burned. I sat back, letting the quiet of the office settle around me. Through the open window, I could hear the faint clang of rigging against masts and the low murmur of gulls. This was my world now, steady, anchored, mine. There was a time I might have overthought my reply. I might have weighed how to soften the edges, how to leave the door open just enough for hope to slip through. But boundaries, I'd learned, aren't built to be ornamental. They're meant to hold. I opened a new email, my fingers moving with a certainty that surprised me. "Michael, thank you for thinking of me. I won't be participating, but I wish you the best with your project." I signed it simply, Evelyn. No explanations, no apologies, no defensive justifications. Just a clear line, drawn with grace. Before I hit send, I glanced toward the silver hairpin on the edge of my desk. I'd removed it earlier when the wind had picked up, but now I slid it back into my hair. A small ritual, a reminder. I pressed send. The whoosh of the email leaving felt final, but not heavy. There was no satisfaction in rejecting him, no secret thrill in closing the door, only relief, the kind that comes from knowing you've acted in alignment with who you are now, not who you were when the wound was fresh. That evening, I walked down to the pier. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, laying a trail of light across the water. I thought about how endings don't always announce themselves with slammed doors or harsh words. Sometimes they arrive as a polite email and a polite refusal. Sometimes they arrive quietly, leaving room for peace to take root. I didn't know if Michael would reply. It didn't matter. I had my work, my home, and a life shaped not by resentment, but by choice. And choice, I had come to realize, was the truest form of freedom. The kitchen was warm with the soft hum of the kettle, the scent of chamomile drifting through the air. I sat in my wicker chair by the window, the same spot where Daniel and I had shared countless quiet moments. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the sea in ripples of gold, and the waves rolled in with a rhythm that felt older than anything I could name. The porcelain cup was warm in my hands. I lifted it, letting the steam brush my face, and took a slow sip. The tea was smooth, comforting, steady, much like the life I'd built in these months. On the table beside me, the silver hairpin rested next to the saucer, catching the sunlight. Its surface had softened over the years, the tiny scratches holding more history than any ledger or contract. Daniel once told me, "Money is just a tool. You are the one who holds the compass." At the time, I'd smiled and kissed him on the cheek, not knowing how much those words would matter when I stood alone. Now, I understood. The compass wasn't about wealth or business. It was about direction, values, and the quiet strength to choose your course, even when the wind turns against you. I leaned back, the wicker creaking softly, and let my gaze wander to the horizon. The harbor was calm. A few gulls wheeled overhead, their calls sharp in the salted air. Somewhere below, the tide whispered against the pilings, steady as breath. I thought about the long road from that cold night at Michael's table to this quiet room. It had not been a straight line. There were moments I could have given in, moments I could have bargained my peace for someone else's comfort. But I hadn't. Setting my cup down beside the hairpin, I let my fingers rest on both for a moment. One hand on warmth, the other on memory. The light from the window spilled across them, and for a heartbeat, I felt Daniel there with me. Not as a ghost, but as the steady presence he'd always been. A compass point, guiding without force. I know some would say I should have tried harder to mend things with Michael, to keep the family whole at any cost. But a family held together by erasing yourself isn't whole at all. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are the shores that keep you from washing away. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this now. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your boundaries, what did you choose? Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits, quietly, until you are ready to open your heart. Take care. I'll see you in the next story.